Hey guys, welcome back to Listen Chump for a new video, this time on Venezuela. Tensions flared up again between the US and Venezuela, with the Trump government conducting military strikes on drug trafficking boats near Venezuela's coasts and asking for closing the country's airspace, and Maduro as usual talking about American imperialism. The country currently has a ruined economy, with living condition indicators among the worst in the world, but this wasn't always the case. Venezuela used to be an American ally and the richest country in Latin America. This video will be about how and why it's changed since Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. Most people blame Maduro for the decline since the worst of it happened under him, while Chavez kept a good reputation and allegedly improved the country. But here I'll be going over the whole process and show that it was the Chavez government which began the country's destruction, all while taking power in a very skillful manner. Venezuela used to be an exception in Latin America. Since dictator Pérez Jiménez's downfall in 1958, it was a democracy with an army subject to the civilian authority in a region dominated by authoritarian regimes and armed struggle. There were moderate and institutionalized political parties, respect for elections, a growing middle class, a stable system, and an economy mostly based on oil exportation. The constitution, established in 1961, guaranteed separation of power and separation of the military from politics. It was only with the coup attempt later in 1992 that the army came back to politics. The system was far from perfect though, because it was a country dependent on oil, with important inequalities and corruption. Venezuela was a founding member of the OPEC in 1960. The oil price shock beginning in 1973 gave the country the highest GDP per person on the continent. But there were with this lots of embezzlement, around $100 billion from 1972 to 1997. Several events led to Chavez taking power. We had the Black Friday on February 18, 1983, with the Bolivar's devaluation because of financial trouble, and which hurt the middle class. Despite that, the dominant political parties COPE and AD didn't change the political system. They dominated labor unions and civil society groups, but had no strong links to the poor. It blew up in February 1989 with riots against the cost of living and austerity policies, with 1,000 dead and lots of looting, and the army had to be sent. Officers like Colonel Chavez said the army had become a Praetorian Guard. They organized a political movement, the MBR 200, with no clear ideology, just an opposition to the status quo. With a rise in poverty and revelations about corruption involving President Perez in 1992, the MBR, with around 10% of the military, attempted a coup d'etat. The rest of the army stopped them, but this meant the return of the military in politics. Many MBR, including Chavez, were arrested, while others continued their activities in the shadows. As a sign of democracy, President Perez was constitutionally removed from power. Rafael Caldera was then elected in 1993. Caldera's presidency was marked by slow growth, high inflation, and a reluctance to implement free market reforms. Caldera also released coup plotters from jail who were organized behind Chavez. For the 1998 presidential election, the old parties AD and COPE were largely unpopular due to their lack of vision, and the way was open for an outsider. Initially, the favorite was the independent Irene Saez, but she made too many mistakes and allowed Hugo Chavez to win with 56%. He skillfully used popular discontent against corruption in the economy, while the parties didn't manage to reform or ally themselves. Chavez was a populist, meaning someone who said he spoke for the poor, all while excluding groups which he didn't consider as part of the people, but rather as interior enemies. He was also a convinced socialist and used Marxist themes, but instead of workers of the world, he spoke about the poor. As with many far-left leaders, the revolution was centered on him, and democracy, with separation of power, pluralism, and institutional accountability, was seen as a bourgeois system. His first step as he came to power in 1999 was a new constitution. He bypassed the legislative by directly establishing a constitutional assembly to write the constitution, and his followers won 123 out of 131 seats. They notably included his wife, his brother, the army chief of staff, and 20 former military colleagues. The new Constitutional Assembly had no legislative powers, but still prevented Congress from meeting and enacting laws, and even removed judges from the judicial system. Those who opposed this were blocked by the military, and the judge-in-chief of the Supreme Court even resigned. The new constitution was pretty ambiguous, with a vague Bolivarian theme and talking about intervening in the economy. It was still largely democratic and guaranteed in principle the separation of powers, but Chavez now had exclusive control over the military and would use all methods at his disposal to bypass the system and enact laws. The first method was enabling laws. It existed in the old constitution. In short, the Congress could enact a temporary law for a few weeks to give powers of decree to the president to solve a crisis around a specific issue. But here, the enabling law adopted on November 2000 was for a long period of time and gave the president powers on practically all aspects of people's lives. He could promulgate laws without debate nor legislative approval, going from the banking system to agriculture to oil. This went against the 1999 Constitution and was used several times. Chavez took advantage of his personal popularity, which as we'll see later was unfounded and came from his charisma and propaganda, as well as political parties' paralysis, to gain more power and establish a personalistic regime. He inverted decentralization to bring more power to Caracas, and to weaken the opposition targeted the business class and civil society groups. Even in labor unions, he worked to eliminate the Confederation of Venezuelan Workers, made of members from other parties, by promising to destroy it and establish his own rival group. The judicial system was progressively submitted by changing its structure and placing loyalists, and the opposition was pointed as enemies of the people, serving the parasite bourgeois. Authoritarian leaders like to maintain flexibility, so institutional rules were weakened, and with them, democracy. The government directly took part in electoral campaigns. With the weakened legislative, the federal government committed more abuse, penalized people who didn't want to join his program, persecuted the opponents, militarized the government, committed patronage, and censored the private medias. The opposition committed big mistakes in reaction. There was a military coup attempt in 2002 and an enormous oil strike in 2002 and 2003, which I'll come back to, which went against the institutional process. The opposition also boycotted the legislative elections in 2005, so the government took advantage to capture the legislative and take more power. A key method for Chavez was referendums. The 1999 Constitution spoke about participative democracy, and the president took advantage to bypass legislative debate and enact by popular vote reforms in all domains. References to the people became usable instruments rather than ends to themselves. Now, many of you will tell me that referendums are always good, that it expresses popular will, except that here we had major manipulation based on his popularity, which, as we'll see, was unfounded. And even in a more democratic system, to govern doesn't necessarily mean following the people. If leaders only follow popular opinion, what are they? Or maybe it's because I'm an old elitist.
It is not to be given to what the people want. It is for what the people don't want but ought to have.
And adding to that, we saw that Chavez didn't even respect his own referendums. In December 2007, his constitutional reform project, so to broaden presidential authority, abolish term limits, and establish the socialist economy, was narrowly defeated by 50.7%. The president then bypassed the referendum by using the judicial system. So in summary, Chavez enacted laws either by legislative maneuvers, referendums on his popularity, or manipulating the judicial to gain more power. As much as he was able to skillfully manipulate the system and gain power, his management of national affairs was just terrible, and that's what we'll see next. We finally come to Chavez's policies. Because of the economic growth at the time and of general improvements in living conditions in the country during his mandate, many, including myself at some point, praised him and pointed that as an example to follow. The president himself did a lot of propaganda to tell people that they were his priority and that everything was getting better. Let's demolish this myth piece by piece. Even before the fall in oil prices in 2014, which sent the country to the abyss, the Venezuelan economy was all but good. Chavez, as a good populist, did just like Perón in Argentina, Allende in Chile, or Garcia in Peru. They put in place expansionist fiscal and economic policies and an overvalued currency to accelerate growth and redistribution. In the short term, they had encouraging results and became convinced that rational economic policy didn't apply to them. This created production strangling, inflation, a fall in real salaries, an accumulation in balance of payment problems, and it was only when the economy went into a tailspin that they attempted to correct. That's exactly what happened in Venezuela. Chavez had expanded the size of the state, which nationalized sectors like electricity and communications. There were strict price controls, and firing employees without government approval was forbidden. Private property, of course, was weakened, notably with ad hoc expropriation. The pillar of Chavez's policy was the use of oil revenue to finance his programs. He had incredible luck with a rise in world oil prices right at the beginning of his term and a fall only after his death, so that's why many people made a false correlation and praised him. The oil sector was already nationalized under state company PDVSA, which kept his autonomy, so the president worked to slowly establish direct control. Basically, he sought to virtually declare war on the private sector to score political points. When in 2002-2003 there were all worker strikes, Chavez took the hard line and fired 18,000 employees, 40% of the total, mostly engineers, technicians, and administrators, which really weakened the sector.
That's a terrible idea.
Because the government overused PDVSA as a milk cow, and because of other factors like poor management, price controls, corruption, and the firings, the company incurred a debt during an oil boom and became unable to invest or simply maintain its equipments. We could add to that Venezuela financed old projects of allies like Cuba and Nicaragua, the Petrocaribe program, and sold at a discount 300,000 barrels per day to countries to gain political backing. This led to a decline in oil production, which is completely crazy when we think that is the government's main economic base. For agriculture, it followed a similar pattern with the land expropriation and price control plan in 2002, and even more from 2007 to 2012 with the development plan. Despite the rise in production in the short term, shortages grew and farmers were so limited by the government that they preferred the black market. Government debt more than doubled under Chavez, strategic oil reserves diminished, and the crisis began in 2012 with the deficit, the decline in production, shortages, and inflation. It's pretty much an exploit to have a massive deficit in an oil boom. The government reacted to inflation with import subsidies, which favored luxury products bought by the rich. We add to that corruption on all levels. The country was already corrupt before, but here with the weakening of democratic institutions and poor financial management, there was an expansion of a system in which everyone takes a cut. We already saw that the economy had expanded thanks to oil revenue and despite the government, and the typical pro-Chavez argument is that he focused on helping the poor and improve living conditions. The government really promoted its Misiones programs everywhere. The Nobel Economic Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz said that Chavez brought education and healthcare to poor neighborhoods, and even The Economist spoke about social gains thanks to the revolution. But in reality, this was largely unfounded. It mostly comes from the decline in poverty from 54% in 2003 to 27.5% at the beginning of 2007, which was mostly due to the growth of GDP per person of 50% during the same period. Except that the Chavez government wasn't efficient in benefiting from that growth. Chavez created a consolidated social fund to coordinate anti-poverty programs financing, with a provision saying that growing oil revenue would supply, but the government ignored the provision in 2001 and instead allocated only a third of the budget it was supposed to be. The Minister of Finance used an accounting loophole to escape from it. There was a 1% decline in poverty per percent of growth in the GDP per capita, which was a poor ratio compared to other developing countries which had twice that. Revenue inequality rose, with the Gini going from 0.44 to 0.48 from 2000 to 2005. Revenue statistics don't tell everything, but even with the rest, the results were disappointing. Chavez didn't even increase the proportion of the budget allocated for health, education, and housing. The percentage from 1999 to 2007 was almost exactly the same as in the 1990s. So it was really the oil prices which caused the improvements. Child mortality decreased, but at the same rate as during the 1990s, and much less than in other Latin American countries. There was even a slight rise in underweight babies from 1999 to 2006. In education, Chavez had launched a program for combating illiteracy, and in 2005 declared his country was illiteracy-free, but in reality the number went from 1.1 million in 2003 to 1 million in 2005. The government said it employed over 200,000 people for the program, or 2% of the workforce, but there was no trace of it in budget or public hiring statistics. For housing, the ratio of homes with no running water rose from 7.2 to 9.4 from 1999 to 2006, and in the same period, the ratio of homes with no floor went from 2.5 to 6.8%, partly because of tight price controls on certain products, a terrible idea which provoked shortages. There was a chronic lack of foodstuff like milk, black beans, or sardines. The black market in 2007 was 215% above the official exchange level. Before the infamous constitutional referendum of 2007 which I mentioned, the government delayed the publication of statistics showing annual inflation of 68% for after the vote. Still, presidential elections were always in times of growth, so Chavez was always re-elected. Chavez used propaganda to compensate, with posters everywhere, and mobilize people with his charisma. After being criticized for not building new housing, he responded by blaming his predecessors even a decade later, but he compensated with media stunts like opening his doors to the homeless. It seems that for some this was more important than the decrease in national purchase power by 15% from 1998 to 2012, or the homicide rate which was fourth in the world at that point. At Chavez's death in 2013, the country was nearing collapse with a very limited democracy and a fragile economy. Venezuela's relations with the US are an interesting case because since Chavez came to power, he constantly asserted that the US were the biggest threat to the continent and enemies of the Venezuelan people. Of course, this narrative was the same in Cuba and in Morales' Bolivia. It was just inspired from communist ideology. The United States were nicknamed the Empire, and all multilateral institutions led by the US like the OAS were to be countered. This also justified rejecting democracy as an imperialist system. And despite assertions from Chavez saying that Washington was in an economic war against the Bolivarian Republic, the United States were for decades the country's first trade partner. It was mostly oil experts which served to pay for expensive social programs in the government's corruption, and we had to wait until the first Trump administration for total sanctions on oil in 2018. Before that, Washington had imposed limited sanctions, like on weapons in 2005 or on individuals in 2014 because of human rights violations. We now come to Maduro's presidency. Nicolas Maduro became president by interim after Chavez's death in March 2013, and then elected in a controversial election in April. He came to power with infrastructures in ruins, power outages, goods shortages, high inflation, declining production, overvalued currency, and rising crime. On top of that, global oil prices went down suddenly because of the shale oil revolution in the US, which made the Americans the first oil producers again. Maduro responded by pushing even harder in the wrong direction, and even though he tries, he doesn't have Chavez's charisma. He implemented measures to raise national morale, like the creation of a Vice Ministry of Supreme Social Happiness, and even moved Christmas to October. It's not a joke, he did it again this year. Despite that, the new president managed to obtain decree powers from the legislative branch, dominated by the Socialist Party, to implement drastic measures in several domains. He notably forced electronic stores to sell at a loss, before targeting car dealers and landowners. He responded to demonstrations against shortages with force, with dozens dead and thousands arrested. The president is abysmal in economic policy, and the country is among the worst in the world in terms of foreign investments. With the economic collapse, he fired PDVSA managers to put a military officer at its head. Agricultural problems grew also, and he answered by blaming producers and imposing even more controls in 2016. In 2017, he established a constituent assembly to bypass the National Assembly, which was in the opposition since 2015. Elections for the new assembly were controversial again, and his wife and son were elected. Venezuela's Attorney General Luisa Ortega Diaz began criticizing the president, so she was ousted and fled to Colombia. With the destruction of the country's legal framework and the militarization of security, law and order just collapsed. The country became the second in the world in 2019 in terms of homicides, with 71 per 100,000. Even before the Great Crash in 2018, conditions were abysmal, and some people even stole zoo animals to eat them. In 2017 and 2018, the Americans, Europeans, and Canadians imposed financial and economic sanctions. Trump notably sanctioned PDVSA and ceased importing oil. It exacerbated problems, with inflation skyrocketing to above 1,000,000%, or 130,000% according to the Venezuela Central Bank. Maduro blamed this on a conspiracy involving the West and his domestic opponents. In reality, it was a cumulative result of policies, sanctions, weak finances, of the central bank printing too much money to finance deficits, and overused evaluations. The president reacted by raising minimum salaries, which made things even worse. People fled the country by millions to neighboring countries, especially Colombia. Venezuela lost 62% of its GDP from 2012 to 2019, and the GDP per capita also collapsed. Despite that, Maduro was re-elected in 2018 in a country with heavy censorship and electoral manipulations, so almost 60 countries recognize his opponent Guaido as the winner. In November 2022, because of higher energy costs due to the war in Ukraine, the Americans diminished their sanctions in exchange for the Venezuelan government to renew dialogue with the opposition and implement real elections. Annual inflation diminished to only 190% in 2023. But with new rigged elections and Caracas's military threats to Guyana for the control of the Essequibo region, Washington reimposed sanctions in 2024. Today, with all this, half of Venezuelans live in poverty. Since 2014, 8 million left the country for a current population of 28 million. In terms of oil production in proportion to reserves, the country is a laughingstock. It has the largest reserves in the world, but its production is a fraction of what it was before Chavez took over in 1999. Venezuela is also among the least free economically according to the Heritage Foundation, just before Cuba and North Korea, and is 178 out of 180 in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Indicator. What helped the country stay alive was support from Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, and Turkey. For Russia, it was for countering the Americans and establishing its influence in the region. Rosneft allowed PDVSA to bypass sanctions, and Russia sold weapons. China, meanwhile, helps with financial loans, but remains more discreet because it knows the risks. Cuba is an ideological partner for the regime and acted as an advisor. For Iran, it's similar to Russia, to oppose the Americans, notably with several small development projects. The Turkish case is the most interesting because it's a NATO country with good relations with Trump notably. Venezuela imports lots of Turkish goods, while Turkey buys oil and gold. Now, with the American strikes on boats coming from the country and Trump's threats, obviously Maduro is posing as a great leader and says, haha, you see they are a threat to us, and asserts that the real reason for this was for taking the country's oil. Alright, that's it for today. I hope you liked the video. I wanted to talk about Venezuela for a long time, and with the recent events, I thought it was a perfect opportunity to talk about its downfall. I'm still working on a video trilogy reassessing the Vietnam War, so stay tuned, you can like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.